The Indiana Fever have just experienced an incredibly chaotic and emotionally charged stretch, with the controversy surrounding DiJonai Carrington and Sophie Cunningham quickly becoming much bigger than a single basketball play. What initially appeared to be one heated moment during a fast break opportunity has developed into a story involving coaching decisions, player safety, fan reactions, social media, locker room unity, and some of the most polarizing debates surrounding the WNBA. In a league where every major incident can instantly become a national conversation, this particular controversy exploded almost immediately, putting multiple players, coaches, and the Fever organization under intense scrutiny. The situation began when DiJonai Carrington was ejected following a hard foul on Sophie Cunningham during a fast break opportunity. The play immediately generated strong reactions because of the force of the contact and the circumstances surrounding it. Some viewers believed Carrington was simply trying to make a defensive play and prevent an easy basket, while others interpreted the contact as intentional and unnecessarily aggressive. Because the incident happened at full speed, people watching the game saw it differently depending on their perspective, and the debate became even more intense once replay footage began circulating across social media. Stephanie White later explained that she did not see the play clearly in real time. From her position on the sideline, she initially believed the officials had made the correct decision based on what she was able to see during live action. After reviewing the footage, however, White acknowledged the severity of the contact while continuing to stand behind her players. Her explanation created another debate because critics felt a head coach should have immediately recognized what happened, while supporters argued that coaches do not always have a perfect view of every incident occurring on the court. White also emphasized something she considered extremely important. She would not allow outside negativity, division, or hostility to destroy the unity inside her locker room. The Fever were already dealing with enormous expectations, and the controversy threatened to shift attention away from their basketball goals. Rather than allowing the incident to divide the team, White attempted to keep her players focused on one another and on the season. Her message was essentially that whatever people outside the organization were saying, the players and coaches needed to remain together. What made the situation even more explosive was everything that happened afterward. Carrington's comments and activity on social media, Cunningham's criticism of the foul, and the enormous reaction from fans created a second wave of controversy. Instead of the discussion ending once the game was over, every new comment appeared to generate another argument. Clips of the foul were reposted thousands of times, opinions spread rapidly, and people began interpreting the incident through completely different political, cultural, and personal perspectives. Cunningham made it clear that she believed the contact was intentional and unnecessary. From her perspective, the foul was not simply an ordinary defensive mistake. She felt the nature of the contact justified the reaction it received and believed players should be held accountable for dangerous actions on the court. Carrington supporters, however, viewed the incident differently and argued that competitive basketball can produce physical plays that look much worse on replay than they appeared in real time. The disagreement between those interpretations became one of the central arguments surrounding the entire story. Carrington's subsequent social media activity generated another wave of criticism. Social media has become an unavoidable part of professional sports, but it can also transform a disagreement into something much larger. A single post, response, or interaction can be screenshot, reposted, clipped, and interpreted by millions of people within hours. In this case, the online conversation became so intense that the basketball play itself was almost overshadowed by everything happening around it. The incident also became connected to larger debates about race, player safety, social media behavior, and the increasingly polarized conversations surrounding women's basketball. Some people focused strictly on whether the foul was legal or illegal. Others saw the controversy as part of a broader pattern in the way certain players are discussed and treated online. Still others argued that sports controversies should remain focused on the actual game instead of becoming political or cultural battles. Stephanie White then found herself at the center of the criticism. After the game, she explained that she considered Carrington's action a hard foul, but did not believe there was an intention to injure Cunningham. That statement immediately drew criticism from people who felt White should have been more forceful in defending Cunningham or acknowledging the seriousness of the contact. Others believed White was simply giving an honest assessment based on what she had seen and later learned after watching the replay. Some commentators even questioned whether White's previous coaching relationship with Carrington influenced her response. They wondered whether familiarity with the player affected the way White interpreted the incident. Supporters of White rejected that suggestion and argued that there was no evidence that her relationship with Carrington changed her judgment. According to that view, White was simply trying to evaluate the play fairly rather than immediately joining the emotional reaction surrounding it. The backlash reached another level when Fever fans began booing Stephanie White inside Gainbridge Fieldhouse. That moment became a major talking point because White was not the opposing coach. She was coaching her own team in front of her own supporters. For a head coach to hear boos from the home crowd is always significant, but in this situation the reaction carried additional weight because it came during a period when the organization was already dealing with intense public criticism. Critics argued that if the home crowd had reached the point of openly booing the head coach, then the situation had become a serious leadership issue. They questioned whether White had properly handled the controversy and whether she understood the frustration being expressed by fans. Some believed the boos represented disappointment with her response to the foul rather than a complete rejection of her coaching ability. Stephen A. Smith also questioned how White could have been coaching from the sideline and not seen the incident clearly. His argument was straightforward. Watching the game, communicating with players, and reacting to important moments are fundamental responsibilities of a head coach. If a controversial play happens directly in front of the bench, critics believe the coach should have enough awareness to understand what occurred. But there was another side to that argument. Basketball games move extremely quickly, and coaches are often monitoring multiple things at once. A head coach may be watching a particular matchup, communicating with an assistant, preparing a substitution, or tracking what is happening away from the ball. Even from the sideline, there can be moments when the exact nature of a foul is difficult to see. That is why replay exists, and White supporters argued that her willingness to change or clarify her assessment after seeing the footage should not automatically be treated as a failure of leadership. While criticism of White was growing, Caitlin Clark made it clear that she and her teammates were standing behind their coach. Clark reportedly told White before the game that the Fever were not going to lose for her. That message was significant because it demonstrated that the controversy had not created the kind of internal division that some outside observers were suggesting. Clark also reportedly said that seeing their own fans boo White before the game made her feel sick. Her reaction showed just how uncomfortable the situation had become inside the organization. For Clark, White was not simply a coach being criticized on television or social media. She was the person leading the team every day, working with the players behind the scenes, and attempting to guide them through a difficult season. Clark emphasized that White was their head coach and that outside noise was not going to tear their locker room apart. That statement presented a completely different picture from the one being discussed by critics. While the outside world was debating whether White had handled the situation correctly, the players themselves appeared determined to remain united. Caitlin Clark then backed those words up on the court. Indiana defeated the New York Liberty 106-92. Producing a major statement in the middle of all the controversy. Clark finished with 22 points and 10 assists, while Kelsey Mitchell led the Fever with 28 points. The victory mattered not only because of the final score, but because of what it represented. The Fever had every reason to be distracted. Their coach was being booed by some of their own supporters, players were being criticized online, and the Carrington-Cunningham incident continued dominating conversations surrounding the team. Yet Indiana managed to put those distractions aside and execute on the court. Instead of allowing the controversy to completely fracture the team, they responded with one of their most important performances. Clark's performance was particularly significant because she had publicly defended White. Her ability to contribute at a high level immediately afterwards strengthened the message that she and her teammates were focused on basketball. Rather than responding to critics through endless arguments online, the Fever had an opportunity to respond through their performance. Kelsey Mitchell's 28-point performance was equally important. While much of the public conversation naturally centered around Clark, Mitchell provided the scoring production that helped Indiana pull away from New York. It was a team victory, and that distinction mattered because the controversy had repeatedly been framed around individual players and personalities. The Fever's win also created a new question. Could this be the moment that the team began turning outside criticism into motivation? Teams often talk about blocking out distractions, but actually doing it is much more difficult. Indiana had the opportunity to demonstrate that their locker room remained strong even when the public conversation around them was anything but calm. Sophie Cunningham also addressed the situation after the game. Although she continued to believe the foul was intentional, she acknowledged Carrington's competitive style and spoke about the broader environment surrounding the Fever. Her comments suggested that the conflict was not simply about one isolated moment. The personalities involved, the intensity of competition, and the enormous attention surrounding the fever had all contributed to the escalation. The debate had now become so intense that players and commentators were discussing not only what happened during the game, but also how social media reactions were affecting the athletes involved. Players are increasingly expected to communicate directly with fans, but that access also means they're exposed to criticism at a level previous generations of athletes never experienced. A controversial play that might once have been discussed for a few hours can now remain relevant for days. Fans can analyze every frame of a replay, search through old social media posts, compare previous incidents, and create narratives that spread far beyond the original event. That reality has made professional sports more interactive, but it has also made it much more emotionally exhausting for the athletes involved. Cunningham later described a face-to-face conversation with Lynx coach Cheryl Reeve. Despite their different viewpoints, they were reportedly able to speak directly, share their perspectives, and leave the conversation with mutual respect. That moment provided an important contrast to the online environment. Instead of communicating through posts, comments, and public criticism, the two were able to have a direct conversation. That is an important lesson from the entire controversy. Two people can strongly disagree about a basketball incident without turning the disagreement into a personal war. In an era where social media often rewards outrage, direct communication can sometimes resolve tensions more effectively than public arguments. At the same time, the controversy surrounding women's sports and transgender participation continued to dominate online discussions. The broader debate has become one of the most polarizing issues in sports, with strong opinions existing on every side. The conversation involves questions about eligibility rules, competitive fairness, inclusion, athlete rights, and the future of women's athletics. The script surrounding this controversy includes numerous highly polarizing comments from different sides of that debate, along with references to policies governing eligibility in women's sports. Those arguments have increasingly become connected to the fever controversy, even though the original incident itself centered on a basketball play between Carrington and Cunningham. That distinction is important. The original event involved a foul during a basketball game. The wider cultural debate developed afterward as people connected the incident to existing arguments about women's sports and athletic competition. Once those issues became part of the conversation, the story moved far beyond the basketball court. The result has been a complicated mixture of basketball, culture, politics, social media, and questions about fairness in women's sports. For many fans, that complexity is exactly what makes the WNBA such a major cultural conversation. For others, it is evidence that sports are becoming unnecessarily politicized and that individual games are being overshadowed by controversies unrelated to the final score. Another major part of the story involves criticism directed at Carrington after the foul and her subsequent social media activity. Different commentators interpreted the incident in completely different ways. Some argued that the play was intentional and deserved the flagrant 2 decision. Others believed Carrington was attempting a legitimate defensive play and simply missed the ball. Carrington herself has previously explained that some controversial contact during games was not intentional, emphasizing that she was attempting to make a play on the basketball. Supporters of that explanation believe context matters. They argue that basketball is an extremely physical sport and that defensive players sometimes make mistakes when attempting to stop an opponent in transition. Critics, however, argue that intent is not always the only factor that matters. Even if a player does not intend to injure an opponent, the nature and force of the contact can still create legitimate concerns about player safety. That is why officials have to make decisions based on what actually happens on the court rather than relying entirely on what a player says they intended to do. The bigger concern, however, is what happens when basketball controversies spill over into personal attacks online. The script highlights how players opposing or competing against the fever can become targets of intense social media criticism. Once a player becomes associated with a major controversy, fans can move from criticizing a particular play to criticizing the person's character, history, appearance, or personal life. That is where sports discussion can become dangerous. There is nothing wrong with debating whether a foul deserved an ejection. Fans can disagree about officiating, coaching decisions, and player behavior. But when criticism becomes harassment, threats, or personal attacks, the conversation moves beyond ordinary sports debate. The script also argues that racial hostility has become part of the online reaction surrounding some of these incidents. Race has become one of the most sensitive elements of the broader conversation surrounding women's basketball, particularly when discussions involve popular players, controversial fouls, and different fan communities. Some people believe racial dynamics influence how players are treated, while others reject those claims and argue that individual actions should be judged independently. Whatever side someone takes on that argument, the growing hostility has made it increasingly difficult for the actual game to remain the focus. Instead of discussing offensive schemes, defensive adjustments, player development, or competitive strategy, fans can spend days arguing about social media posts and cultural issues. The controversy demonstrates how quickly one foul can become a much larger cultural argument when millions of people are watching and reacting online. A single moment on the court can become a headline, a viral clip, a debate on television, and a trending topic across multiple platforms. Charles Barkley is also brought into the discussion because of his history of speaking openly about controversial issues in sports. Barkley has never been known for avoiding difficult subjects, and his comments on competition between men and women in sports have frequently generated strong reactions. His involvement adds another layer to the broader conversation because his statements are often amplified far beyond the original context. The script presents Barkley's position on competition between men and women in sports and connects it to the wider debate surrounding women's athletics. Meanwhile, the WNBA's rules and broader policies governing eligibility have become another point of discussion as commentators continue debating the future of women's sports. These conversations have added another layer to an already complicated situation surrounding the fever. What started as a foul became a discussion about coaching. That discussion became a debate about fan loyalty. The online reaction then expanded into arguments about race, social media, gender, sports policy, and fairness. Despite everything happening around them, the Indiana Fever continued to focus on basketball. The team defeated the Liberty, Clark produced a strong individual performance, Mitchell delivered a major scoring contribution, and the players publicly demonstrated support for Stephanie White. That does not mean every question surrounding the coach has disappeared. Critics still believe White should have responded differently to the Carrington incident. They believe she should have immediately recognized the seriousness of the contact and communicated stronger support for Cunningham's safety. Her supporters, however, argue that she made a judgment based on what she saw at the time and later acknowledged what the replay showed. From that perspective, changing or clarifying an opinion after reviewing additional evidence is not weakness. It can instead be viewed as an honest response to new information. The bigger test for White will ultimately be what happens next. Coaches are judged by their ability to lead through adversity, manage personalities, maintain discipline, and keep their teams focused. One controversial press conference or one difficult decision does not necessarily define a coach. Consistency over an entire season is what ultimately determines whether players and fans trust the person leading the organization. For the Fever, maintaining locker room unity may be even more important than winning the argument online. No matter how many people criticize them, the players still have to share the court. They have to communicate with one another, trust each other defensively, execute offensive plays, and remain mentally prepared for the next opponent. Caitlin Clark's response suggested that the players remain united. Her willingness to publicly support White was significant because Clark herself is one of the biggest stars in women's basketball. When someone with that level of influence speaks about the team's internal environment, people naturally pay attention. The 106-92 victory over New York demonstrated that the Fever can still perform under enormous pressure. It did not erase the controversy, but it provided evidence that the players were capable of separating the noise from their basketball responsibilities. Ultimately, this entire episode raises a much bigger question. Can the Indiana Fever turn all of this attention and controversy into motivation rather than allowing it to become a distraction? That question may define the next stage of the story. Every team eventually faces adversity, but the strongest teams are often separated by how they respond when things become difficult. The Fever now have an opportunity to prove that the controversy can strengthen their focus rather than weaken it. Caitlin Clark's response suggested that the players remain committed to one another. Stephanie White has an opportunity to answer her critics through her coaching. The rest of the roster has an opportunity to demonstrate that their identity is defined by what happens between the lines rather than by what people say about them online. The Carrington-Cunningham incident may have started as one controversial play, but it evolved into a major story about leadership, accountability, player safety, fan loyalty, social media, race, culture, and the intense debate surrounding women's sports. And perhaps the biggest takeaway is that the basketball itself should not be forgotten. Behind every viral clip are athletes who still have to prepare for the next game. Behind every social media argument are players dealing with the emotional consequences of public scrutiny. And behind every controversial decision is a coaching staff trying to make the best possible judgment in an incredibly fast-moving environment. For Indiana, the path forward is relatively simple even if the circumstances are complicated. Stay together, keep playing, and let the results speak. The Fever cannot control every headline, every social media reaction, or every opinion from commentators. What they can control is their preparation, their effort, their communication, and how they respond when adversity arrives. The 106-92 victory over New York may therefore represent more than just another win. It could become a turning point, a moment when the Fever decided that the controversy would not define their season. Whether that becomes reality will depend on what happens from here. The debate surrounding Carrington and Cunningham is unlikely to disappear immediately. Neither are the arguments about coaching, player safety, social media, and women's sports. But eventually, the Fever will have to move beyond the controversy and return their attention to the competition itself. Because when a next game begins, the questions will no longer be about what happened on social media. They will be about who performs under pressure, who executes when the game is close, who protects their teammates, and who has the discipline to stay focused when everyone outside the locker room is watching. For Stephanie White, that is the ultimate opportunity. For Caitlin Clark and the rest of the Fever, it is a chance to prove that their unity is stronger than the noise surrounding them. And for the WNBA, the controversy is another reminder of just how powerful, and sometimes explosive, the combination of professional sports, social media, celebrity, and culture has become. One foul started the conversation. But what happens next will determine whether this becomes a temporary controversy or one of the defining stories of the Fever's season.